intellectual traditions and histories, intimacy and affect, popular culture, and feminist pedagogies. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Mupotsa on a recent project hosted by the Wits Institute, whose goal was to contribute to the discussion on African feminism in South Africa. It's a pleasure for me to continue working with them on these themes at this conference. Their talk this afternoon is entitled On Permission. Once Dr. Mupotsa has concluded the talk, we will have a question and answer session. Here, attendees can respond to the talk by either raising their hands or submitting their questions to the chat screen. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mupotsa to the visual stage. The floor is yours, Danai.
Thank you, and thank you for that delightful introduction. I also enjoyed working with you. Thanks also to Lenka for the invitation to speak today, and also for being super patient with me. I'm the worst at admin, and I've been particularly awful in the last couple of months. So I'm really grateful for your patience and your kindness. Also, thanks to Ntabi Singh for the keynote yesterday and the dense reading she offered. It's this gift of hearing someone speak so meticulously to how we read the everyday, and I really appreciated it. On permission, I guess I'm going to spend this time talking about how I came to this title, to this the process of how, I guess, rather than a what that I wanted to do. It's several encounters or experiences I had where this question of permission would show up, and I'm sort of thinking about the kind of permission that I take or have had as a kind of praxis, a kind of method. And the first encounter actually is with my colleague who's here, Grace Musila. We were in a conversation on Black archives, and we were approached to think about narrative practice. And as we're talking through our own sort of methods of reading narrative and our work in general, I'm constantly thinking about the I feel like I occupy very many locations in terms of what, scholarly locations, in terms of disciplinary field or methodological approaches or questions. So I'm constantly shifting between, so I'm constantly reflecting on it. But I think to take the time to think about narrative at the time for me was grounded in particular around thinking around loss. And this conversation we had with Grace was, I think, 2017 or 18. The years now happen so quickly, it's difficult to be precise. So of course, this is also in the wake around, around questions around the curriculum, questions around institutional culture and decolonization, on everyone's tongue, and the ways that loss was being, the bodies that loss was being attached to was the bodies of Black people, for example, in sense of the feeling of having lost, let's say, an education that's oriented around a world where you are not simply being acculturated by it, you possess the loss itself or the lack itself in terms of what you're demanding, in terms of a change is to be replaced, to be put back into something. But what I was actually feeling like I was watching, and I think it was a conversation that ended up circulating around Shakespeare and the risk of losing Shakespeare, was that actually that loss is for those who are monolingual meaning people who have only had to see the world from one point of view because the world is made for them. So they don't know how to operate across across orientations to the world. So to lose that one way of looking, say, for example, at Shakespeare, to say that there may be 20,000 other approaches is devastating, because that monolingualism is also, of course, a system, a structure of power. And so that kind of mastery of that singular point of view, or inability to move across translations or orientations or capacities to know or sense the world is terrifying for the one who has never been stopped in any situation. And what was delightful also, delightful is my word for the day, let's say, in that conversation with Grace was then the opportunity to read together an article, a research note as it's called, that she wrote titled, well, the title I don't have, but she defines epistemic disarticulations. And this is about that thinking through, I'm actually going to look at what I've written down so I can be very precise. The blind spots, opacities, and deceit that result from a mismatch of assumptions and ideas, in terms of what she terms epistemic disarticulation between researchers and the communities that they study. That distance, I suppose, also then a form of capacity, but also a relation of loss. And so that we have this conversation that was quite rich about opacity in the sense of that the kind of work of narrative where often the assumption of the one who comes to know, whose authority is established, is their capacity to make transparent, or to translate, to make transparent, to make all meaning available in terms of how they engage or how they construct their own authority over the knowledge. So if I engage in research and I now articulate my authority over the object of my study, that narrative encounters precisely relies on my mastery and my kind of disentangling of every potential opacity. And so and that is often the construction of knowledge that we are immediately, are trained into across disciplinary formations. So that was a really useful moment for me, but also what was then really interesting to me as we are talking, because we were asked to think through our own practice and our own methods, is then Grace says, but it's so interesting that you have, she says, she asked me about permission, like who gave you the permission to do the things that you, that you do? And so I started thinking about permission then, in the sense that, in the sense of like, because I had never thought about the things I was doing or how I was doing them as me. I've never thought to ask someone for permission, for example, so I started to think about that inheritance or that capacity. But also I'm thinking and I'm reading with that article on my mind. I'm also thinking, and then of course at the time and continuously, about certain kinds of indexes which show, so the index of Africa, for instance, whether we're working in the disciplinary formation of African studies or working in women and gender studies or feminist theory, and then Africa also comes to be a particular kind of marker, just like Black woman comes to be a particular kind of marker. And that body, and I use body also to, the territory of that body constructs knowledge in such a way that the authority of the speaker, and this goes also to questions of citational practice or the kind of intellectual and political genealogies that we follow or trace or pursue, is that often then within that body of knowledge or that body of practice, that what that index does or starts to signify is in relation to the authority of the speaker who thinks and therefore who knows, whose capacity to know is established, is often a site of contention, and then that's around, so in what first in the frame of who we anticipate as our audience. So the assumption that, so speaking from my position, when I present knowledge, I assume that the audience that I'm engaging with in terms of what they know and what I reveal or how I reveal it to them is on the basis of needing to explain certain kinds of things that I may or may not necessarily need to explain to a different kind of audience. The assumed audience requires access or entry into a particular kind of life world that is presumably very different than their own. So that aspect of translation in terms of a construction of audience, but also that my authority must also be constructed over my conquest of that object, which I reveal in terms of the ways that I demonstrate what I know over the people I'm describing in relation to an audience that is going to be fascinated and amused by it, because now they know something new about something that is very different. So that operation of difference and the kind of construction of the body that is examined and the authority of the person who comes to have the knowledge of it. And so this is a set of questions that she engages in that piece, but also is very deeply connected to to what I was thinking about as this kind of frame of permission, of what we get permission to do or how. And also thinking about it because I've landed in African literary and cultural studies, but I really have no disciplinary training myself. And so in different parts of, I mean, we could say that's, maybe we can debate what a disciplinary training is, but I certainly lean towards certain kinds of methods, but my training in Black studies as well as in women and gender studies has lent me to this kind of weird space where I come to understand how disciplines are formed, and I'm very attentive to it because I need to understand how arguments are made and what methods are used and how evidence is used and how authority is constructed. So I'm constantly thinking through it. I'm constantly, tracing these formations because they were never given to me with any kind of authority. This is anthropology from day 1 to day 25. I've not had that entry. So my entry is a bit haphazard. So therefore I missed the point where I get permission. And I missed this also in history, and I missed this also in other fields that I enter into, of course, also including literary studies. So that permission I took for granted might also just be that lack of discipline, but what it also means is a very specific attentiveness, an intentional attentiveness to when I enter a formation, I'm very attentive to its construction of knowledge and how that authority is made, because that's what I'm interested in doing or thinking through. So thinking with narrative, of course, has been one of a really important caveat for me, perhaps even in the ways that I try to locate myself within different disciplinary forms. I noticed the ways also that narrative is constructed, narrative being a way to think also questions of form, but also often disciplinarily, the object that is under study is intentionally, my authority comes from my ability to really properly objectify it. And so I suppose what narrative offers differently is that it can also resist that relation of authority in the sense that it may not always just demand the separation of the object and the subject. The narrative can do the work of engaging with both. And for me, this is one approach, I think. This is also Barbara Christian's way of thinking about theory, using poetry as the example, where there are objects that resist this tenacity to objectify in order for the authority of the one who comes to speak is made. And I think also thinking in narrative or thinking in the kinds of ways that things that refuse this is also, again, to think also in the practice of what we do, at least what I would like to do in terms of making sense of the world as what I perceive as scholarship, is also an engagement with the sacred, which is another realm around that Tabi Seng took us to in her keynote yesterday, a realm that is structured into what it means to begin from or with experience in terms of questions of how we read, how we speak, how we write, our orientation to the world, the frame from which we kind of unbundle the very notion of expertise itself, and how it's built again on this objectifying or distancing or translating project. You literally, to be most authoritative, you need to literally seem like you are completely a stranger to it. And so, and of course, ironically, a part of, I think, what's interesting in terms of thinking about the sacred, but also other ways of sensing or perceiving the world at the heart of this endeavor, to trust one's own intuition, for example, and to work from the place of intuition as a kind of legitimate capacity to know and articulate, engage the world. I also perceive that there may be very strong reasons for very strong forms of objectivity, because what we enter into now is, where does that go? And I think often the sense that objectivity is constructed by this kind of universal God's eye distance, which often is asking us to translate to a world that is positioned. We take it for granted, but it is positioned. So here I would say a strong objectivity would be one to name it, to name who this assumed audience of the journal article is, to name who the assumed authority is and position them. And that's a stronger objectivity, because I want to know why I'm being asked to learn that person's intuition as a way to then establish my own capacity or authority. I want to engage in the assumptive logics. And I think that can only really begin when one is inside their own body, in the fullest way, in the most discomforting way, in the most, it's really hard in general for us to live in our own bodies. We're not willing to do the work of just simply feeling what doesn't make sense, because it's not something we're very well trained to do. But this also goes then to a question of abstraction, and in particular how abstraction again becomes this another scene around which authority is constructed. An abstraction for me is distinct from, say, opacity, in the sense that, because one could assume that something being very opaque is then too abstract, and often, and I think the feedback many people I know and love often receive is around, in fact, I remember this man saying to me, "You're very opaque, Danai," and this is when I started thinking about opacity as a method, because he didn't understand what I was saying, but I thought I was saying quite simple things, but I think the worldview that I was speaking in was, and that I refused to translate some things, was the space that was incommensurate between us, that some of us would experience often as abstraction. You're reading this theory and it's deeply abstract, and then therefore it must be really smart, and then it's also non-fashion. And so now there's a way that I use it over what I'm analyzing as a way to then establish my authority, because that's the one everyone is saying. But also when we sit down together and we're like, what does this word even mean? We don't quite know, right? But of course, abstraction has this capacity to not only establish your authority over, but also it's precisely how the context from which a concept or an idea that may emerge with a deeply intense commitment to dealing with something wrong in the world becomes easy to then throw in your mouth and then assume that the work of a kind of politically just, which we now also think is the same thing as to think critically, is to be like, well, now I'm on the most politically just or woke moment to ride that wave, that abstraction, that theorizing abstraction works to precisely augment the various systems and powers that structure, our own criticality is literally the price for things to simply continue as they are, despite our own claims to be doing something much more interesting. I think also with the sacred, in terms of not only the intuitive, but also that the taking for granted, again, this unpositioned so-called objectivity of secularism that shapes and informs so much of what we know. So people are literally inside and outside their own body, because now I'm sitting here and I don't believe that I don't work and engage in a way that assumes that, or believes that, or you would believe me that I imagine people have a soul. Or that for me to sit and do this keynote and when I take my shoes off and to feel the ground is connected to how, a kind of, not a kind of split Freudian subject of multiplicity, but also a sense of that often a lot of what we know is not individually our own, whether we inherit it, genetically, or our souls are multiple or connected in relation to others. So I think that, and I think it's crucial also in thinking about our role as thinkers and scholars and writers, because in an increasingly neoliberal university, Wits, if you look on Wikipedia, is now described as a public research institution, and that linguistic shift to research it says a lot about the kind of priority of the priorities of what we do. So we're not teachers, right? But it also says something about the disconnection between the epistemological and the pedagogical that so densely shapes the kind of intellectual praxis that we end up being forced to do. So thinking about sacred as a grounding in this sense, so for me, is also the insistence on the pedagogical as a modality, as a kind of wishing, aspiring for, a grieving, a kind of awareness, attentiveness, and intentionality of how we inhabit or sense or perceive the world. The second encounter that brings me to this, of course, I've just come from a panel where when Lenka asked me for a title, I was thinking about my conversations with my friends Lucien, Elena, and Sala about epistemic habits. Epistemic habits being a frame that Sala Aldrin is very interested in. Like, what are the feminist epistemic habits? This is how we make arguments. This is how we show evidence. So thinking with this, thinking with that, with them and those ideas at the time, and then Linka asked me for a title, and I was like, and that connection came together, and I thought, okay, this is something I could do. Thinking about it, they say with Lucien about lack. So what when in conditions, if lack is this kind of anticipatory condition, what forms of knowing or capacity are made, and what kind of narrative forms can that take up? And that's been some of the ways I think we've been talking with each other, but also then about the classroom as a particular practice, right? Not just a space, but a particular set of practices and that kind of attention. And then connecting also with another friend who's recently been, and I think responding to maybe some of the questions that you were posing in your paper, actually, around the kind of theoretical moves that become popular, like decolonial. I think I made a comment in a meeting recently around organizing, where I was like, now you can decolonize everything to the point of like, my class is decolonial, so the kind of, when something enters our central registers, our central frameworks, it becomes a kind of bandage over any kind of nonsense, because we don't know, we don't have the courage maybe, or sometimes because we are monolingual, we don't even know how to reach the gap between what we don't actually understand about a particular epistemological turn and its political demands. So that level of abstraction is safer than dealing with what that unknowing. And so she talks about this in terms of thinking about feminist epistemic communities, as, so rather than a kind of quick fix of add diversity or decolonial or add this Black woman or add and stir or function through kind of a theoretical abstraction, what would it mean to take seriously sort of a kind of assemblage of the person in community, a kind of intentionality, not only around citation, and I will say citation over and over again, because it's just remarkable to me what citational practices continue to look like, despite many people talking about this for a really long time. It seems quite intentional and willful, in fact, to not cite, for example, Black women. What does it mean to think about the different forms of community sustained, not only through the kind of classrooms one has been in, if one has had the fortune of like a feminist classroom, but that, so my classmates become interlocutors. We know, for example, my community, but that community may also appear, and I think people like Horata Chengeta, for instance, talking about forming community, simply, I read you and I saw something and I start to construct forms of community in this kind of way around a set of idea practices that aren't simply functional on the basis of the proposition of a kind of idea turn as it occurs. So permission is a way that I was starting to think about or think through this kind of set of practice, this kind of set of orientation. The final encounter is more recent, and I was invited to lead a reading group discussion at the University of Johannesburg. And my dear friend, Paolo Frassinelli, he describes it, I said some meetings and he describes it as gender and affect. So I was like, this is not the way that I title things. It was very descriptive, but also confusing, but also, I guess this is what he read of it. And I think some of it, the frame of it was because I had included a range of readings around, I guess, intimacy, and that may be a way to think through or describe it. But one of the readings I offered is a recent article that I published titled Conjugality. And that article itself has had this really interesting life, very similar also to the life of the article I mentioned first, Grace Masilla's, because the article itself is a reflection of the process of writing the article itself and how one establishes their own authority. And so this final life, of course, this is an inclusion and special issue on the queer and the customary in Africa, but there have been many previous versions, and that kind of, and part of that is a question of, well, is this the right audience, or is this, but also this is not the way I want to write it, or what you're asking me to answer or frame as argument, or how you want me to just establish my authority over, over the object of analysis narratively doesn't work. So there's been kind of shifts and moves. And in the first version I presented at a Wish seminar at WISA, and I'm talking about Black women's sexualities, and people, the eyes are wide open. It's so exciting. It's so sexy. Tell us more. It's delicious. And I was like, this is not going to work, because this is not what I wanted. I'm like, I want to talk about this, but this kind of enjoyment that I am happy to theorize and discuss with you, and also analyze and put it down. But I certainly don't want to engage in the kind of scholarly practice that makes people enjoy things that they find exotic and delicious. So let's rethink this. And then I end up trying to enter another set of conversations, then a special issue, re-engaging with Vance's really important edited volume on pleasure and danger. And this is because I'd always struggled with this idea that when we don't know how to think about forms, relations, and of power, that agency becomes this kind of placeholder for people, for that what's difficult to articulate about power itself. And so this volume had several essays that I thought were useful. And so I frame it in this way. And part of the feedback I received in terms of what I was arguing was that, oh, this is a new way of looking at queer theory. You've got a new theory of anti-normativity, and this newness as a kind of critical value, and not only newness, but newness with an audience primarily of queer theory, but what they're framing as queer theory is very clearly a particular intellectual history of a Northern queer theory. So not even perhaps a queer theory that I could identify in the main for myself. And so I was like, maybe that's not what I want to do. So maybe this is not the precise audience. And that was another life of it. So by the time I come to this life, narratively, there's certain things I'm a little bit stubborn about. And there's certain things that I come to know about certain kinds of scholarly practices or logics. So for example, and also in terms of thinking about how Black people's lives are read in general. So for example, the fact that simply saying Black people have affect can be someone's conclusion that should be an assumption that we know, and yet it can be legitimately positioned as a conclusion because our scholarly practices do not know what it means to think about Black people's lives outside of particular political formation. So it's consumption, or it's an entry into modernity. So it's got a temporal frame that is located in an assumptive logic about the world, where constant re-entry into a specific kind of Euromodernity is the only frame from which we can historically, that Black people can enter in as a kind of historical subject. Or, thinking about how movements between disciplinary forms or assumptions taken between disciplinary forms travel. So for example, social history, borrowing from the assumptive logic of social anthropology to assume that language not only equals to culture, but that one's entry into a historical process of becoming a historical subject is encoded through their development within the frames of kind of a border of an ethno-linguistic grouping. That borrowing into social history from social anthropology, also borrowing from, say, the assumptions of psychoanalysis, where the subject develops or grows not only into an adult sexuality, presumably, which is different. So that developmental model, a progressive model as a kind of assumptive logic, but that's mapped onto these kind of ethno-linguistic boundaries. So there's transferences between disciplinary formations. I'm now like, I'm much more attentive to this. And this is why I have not been able to find the language to articulate what I mean when I observe the set of relations that I'm describing, because the assumptions that are rooted across these disciplinary formations are so easily carried over, they don't need to even be named. And so I think then this question of permission, also this question of critical value, that critical value of my intervention had to rely on two things. So one, I've mastered this set of things on this, and my mastery is so good that I can tell you why all of them are crap because I'm the best one. That's critical value. Or the critical value is, this is new, or emergent. And it's new because it's different from everybody I mastered, but also I've got a new case study that no one has looked at. And that's how I established my critical value. And I was like, what happens if that's not what I'm interested in at all? What kinds of writing would that look? What kind of writing, what kind of narrative would that look like? And I think that there've been, of course, many guides to this kind of approach to research. I think like Zora Neale Hurston thinks about research as this formalized curiosity, you're prying with purpose. And I think that's part of how I came into my own. I'm just watching people and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, this thing. How come I also know how to do it? What is this? And then that curiosity is where I begin. And these methods, these tools I have for explanation are just completely inadequate, so to speak. And I think it's connected also to particular kinds of willful, because what happens in this reading group is that I said 5 readings, but this one is the one that we talked about the most. And what everyone was asking was, Danai, but who gave you permission to do this? And who gave you permission to do this? And it was a laundry list of permission. Like, there's permission you took to do this, there's permission you took to do this. How do you get permission to? And so this question of permission and I was like, okay, so clearly permission is something that is it's on the surface of the skin. The minute it shows up when someone is doing something that they're not sure if they're allowed to do, then it must be somewhere. So this is where I'm thinking. I think it's also connected. My final thought, I think, before I conclude, to this question, the kind of willful, unwillful ways of reading. In particular, I'm thinking about Black and African women in terms of theory, in the sense that, so not only do we inherit these terrible habits of how to do knowledge and establish our authority, but that you can do the most theorizing in the world. And I speak to something that Khurata Chengeta has written about, where the experience of a classroom where you ask for Black and African women to be included in feminist theory. And so they're included in the readings, but the method of reading, the method of interpretation, it's hard to name. And then you realize, oh, how come every time we read this one, we're not thinking about the theoretical, we're thinking of them empirically. That for all of the fanciness that you can articulate, all of the abstraction in the world, that the interpretive and analytical work of reading you is again about the Black womanness of your body and the empirical material you might, or example, or for further case study that you might be for someone, because the reading, the capacity to engage the narrative you are producing from the position you are speaking, from this place of so-called universal and objectivity, universalism and objectivity, cannot carry the demand to think of this work as theoretical. And so at the heart, I think of this question of, but Danai, how can you do this? Is like, I'm scared, I just want to be thought through or read through with some kind of, without this kind of very willful racism and sexism, let's call it what it is. I want people to take my ideas, and part of that is about the narrative voice that I take. And if I do the narrative voice that you propose, it certainly confirms this method of reading me. And so that, I think, is at the heart of this question also, in terms of even the very question around citation itself, or, so I can maybe let me conclude there with that thought. That maybe I'll conclude with one last scene, and it's just I was invited to, based on the basis of the same paper, I was invited to a panel on the queer customary at the American Comparative Literature Association conference, which was this weekend. And if anyone's ever been to that conference, every conference has an affect. This one, the affect, half the time I was pretty sure people were reading their papers with the Adobe like read out loud. So this is kind of like when you're really, really smart and you have lots of really strong words, the way you read and the way you speak is like this really, it's very affective, but it's completely affectless. Like, the willful misunderstanding is also something I was struggling with, which sounds like the Adobe is reading by itself, but it's a person. So it's a particular kind of there's a deep interest in theory there. So the invitation is like interesting, and it's on the basis of not because it's Africa or women's sexuality or a case, it's because of a set of ideas, theoretical propositions. And so I'm like, oh, this is so fancy. Like, Mama, I made it. People are taking me seriously as a theorist. And it was, so I'm in this session, and absolutely, because people's work was on very different things. It wasn't, well, I have Black lesbians and you have this. It was like, I'm looking at the ink blot, literally, or I'm looking at, you know, this place in the 18th century. And so that the comparison was a theoretical comparison rather than the case comparison. And I thought, this is really interesting. And this is a really interesting method. And there was certainly very many interesting things about how we read. For example, thinking about reading an anthology parasympathetically, because in an anthology, people are speaking together, but it's not coherent like a monograph, right? So there's, I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about this. But what was also striking in the kind of elevation of that abstraction in relation of ideas was that some very important questions of context disappeared. So it's possible to think of the subject, to think of the slave as a particular kind of capacity in this kind of densely theoretical way, as though that was never a real category of experience that is still rooted in how racial capitalism works today. And so and then I'm stuck again. And so I guess permission, this question of permission I want to conclude is then thinking what forms, again, can this permission take in terms of who we read, how we read each other, how we reference each other, how we build a language for writing, thinking together, writing together, which I think there have been many models of. There's no invention here. This is the newness of my claims, but it's a set of conversation I'd like to put on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danai, from that. That was incredible. I mean, where do I start? I mean, for me, particularly my key takeaways was how your talk was about how we think about the way we think, how we think about the way we think. And so what was really interesting about your talk is that you guide, not only in the sense you don't just speak about this method, you actually guided us in the thinking processes that you go through, the certain issues that you bring on when you start, in a sense, engaging in this kind of practice. So it's, for me, it's like you make certain epistemic moves, let's say, in terms of like when you talk about wanting to move away from epistemic disarticulation, in a sense, there's a very strong sense of I mustn't become, let's say, what's the word I'm looking for? I mustn't become complacent. I must constantly be at work. When I enter space in my narrative, who I am, I must acknowledge, in a sense, what is going on. And I mustn't put myself, in a sense, in bad faith. I mustn't put myself in a space of a space in which I myself might be engaging in those practices of power. So I really enjoyed that. And another thing I really got from your talk was, in a sense, how you talked about queer spaces and talk about spaces of unknowing. And for me, the spaces of unknowing, in a sense, are in a sense queer spaces. I mean, when you look at the word, what queer means, it means strange and odd. And it's also it was once a pejorative term, and even still used as a pejorative term. But it's amazing how, in a sense, those odd spaces have now become spaces of resistance, where the knower is privileged within a society that values the knowers. But here you are saying, no, we must move away from those spaces of authority, resist them, in a sense, engage in these spaces of unknowing. And like when you bring on the concept of spiritualism, for me, that was really powerful, because it's one of those spaces like, okay, honestly, I'm still trying to unpack what is spiritualism? What is this experience that we talk about when we talk about to be spiritual? It's more than just being connected. There's also that sense of uncomfortability, and that uncomfortability is really like when you talk at it in terms of it being listening to your intuition. I thought that was very powerful in terms of how you say the intuition itself becomes sites of knowledge. So, I mean, I would be very interested to, like, if you could speak more on that after people's questions, if you could speak more, how can this intuition become a method, especially a method of, in a sense, a method of resistance? And it's when you gave the example of being told that you are being opaque, and I mean, that person was coming from a space of, okay, now you're making me feel like I don't know, when actually my whole identity and my whole site of privilege is being the knower. And so it's almost like, okay, the space of spirituality, these queer spaces, in a sense, one has to almost, you have to enter them also. If you're going to enter these spaces, you yourself also have to become, you have to be humble. You have to let go of those practices of power when you enter these spaces. And is that it's not just about you coming and gaining the knowledge, it's also about you coming in, respecting, understanding, and not coming in here as a space of knowledge, but in a sense, coming into these spaces as not as learners, and not coming in there as, in a sense, teachers to give knowledge, but rather, in a sense, to collectively learn. Okay, but sorry, that was me exploiting my position, my position as host. So please, I would like to open up the session to the participants. Let me see, what questions do we have? Sorry, let me see, everyone. Cool.
Well, you're looking, I want to say two things about what you said before I forget them. I think bad faith, I think there is bad faith. There's no space of freedom of bad faith. So I think that there's a way to, so I think part of it is simply being able to be attentive to it, even in our own practice of bad faith, rather than to be like, well, I'm going to get rid of it. It's going to be there. There's no place where you're going to, like, I'm in this conversation, there's some bad faith. I'm in conversation with my child, there's bad faith. So I think it's going to be there. And from the question of intuition, for me, it's as much as a simple a thing as acknowledging that people have souls, which I think we take for granted in general. But it can also be simply the way the biomedical bodies, just if your own body can do things neurologically, you have responses. It's not a separation of a kind of the spirit and then the body is there. And it's also that just attentiveness, that intuition is not just what comes from outside in, but it might simply be your heart pace going faster, So just short, but Lenka has let me not chair you. Lenka has a question.
Thanks for cheering me tonight. And thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk. It was really amazing. And yeah, the permission, obviously, yeah, I actually have a question and I started thinking about today. I received a request to review an article for a special issue in Agenda on COVID-19. So I want to ask you, yes, I want to ask you whether you were thinking about this idea of permission and on authority and experts and expertise and objectivity and things in relation to COVID-19, because this is actually kind of like asking for an advice. So I find myself, when I'm talking to my relatives back in Czech Republic, about COVID-19, who want to take this deworming, medicine for horses to kill the virus. And, in that moment, I get into this mode where I'm like, objective knowledge and the data, and it doesn't work. And, and I'm actually surprised listening to myself, how not only that I'm using data, but the way how I'm talking about them is very kind of habitual, conservative way of, calling upon a certain authority, which otherwise in my life and in my scholarship and in every way I'm trying to counter. So if you have any thoughts on this, how to negotiate this horrible and unexpected space where we are triggered to these always, maybe we've learned through schooling and through everything. Thank you.
We have the other two as well. So I also have a moment to think about what you're saying. Sorry, Momo. I've stopped cheering myself.
Cool, sorry. I'm trying to see the hands here. Sibuyisiwe, please can you, you got the floor? And then Deirdre afterwards. Cool, are you guys able to unmute?
Okay, Thank you so much. I was not able to unmute myself. Danai, thank you so much for that presentation. Very insightful. I'm much more interested in, since this is a kind of like feminist space, in terms of your thoughts on how, specifically for us women, the kind of responsibility we have in terms of breaking, of course, the habitus of speaking about the other in a form of authority. Feminism being about grounding yourself, you know, in women's experiences, how they view themselves in their world and all of that. I'm just interested in the kind of, you know, how do we go about, you know, as women, you know, accepting our, you know, our privileges, sexualities, you know, stance, class, race, and all of that, continue to critique this habitus, because what we see now, it's kind of a form of gender mainstreaming rather than, you know, in terms of positionality, rather than a feminist critical thinking that speaks with the people rather for. So I'm constantly in negotiation, you know, with myself, even with the research that I do, in terms of how do we become, you know, conscious and ethical and responsible and ground ourselves in that manner, even as women speaking for, behalf, or with other women. That's my question.
Danai, want to answer that, or should I take on a second question?
Deirdre as well, and then I'll go all three.
Cool, Deirdre, you got the mic. Are you able to unmute yourself? Cool. There we go.
Thanks, Danai. That was a wonderful, wonderful paper, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I love the way in which you draw such rigorous attention to our own practices as scholars and as academics and as thinkers who are supposed to know. For some reason, I'm thinking in French here, le sujet est supposé savoir. So I was just wondering how your thoughts about permission relate to Eleanor's presentation about wild and wayward and connected and solitary academic epistemic pursuits. I think it would be very interesting to explore those connections. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay. So Lenka and Sivu. So I think I want to maybe approach together that question. So I guess for me, I mean, when I used to be super anxious about, I mean, I think I'm still super anxious. Sometimes I can sit with like that, the material for that paper I sat with for almost 10 years, because part of being trained in feminist research, like, oh, you have to be ethical in people's lives and, you know, and then you have this weight of this thing. And some simple thing like, you know, you do an interview with someone and then you're like overwhelmed with the follow-up and the sharing of the, you know, what do we share? And because, and I think part of the responsibility, or I guess of being accountable maybe for, is that, I mean, not only that, you know, at the end of it, when you know, this is by Danai Mupotsa, it's not by Danai and Ningi. So there is an authority that you will eventually claim. It's connected to your livelihood and your capacity to live, but also to function and have a profession. But I think it is also connected to that there is a distance between what's articulated. In fact, what happens in that moment of an interaction is constructed by your intention, right? So so whether your intention of how you engage or observe what people are doing or saying, or what you put on the table for people to make into. And so attentiveness to that, and attentiveness also to to your, and because sometimes, an example is sometimes I'm talking with women, I'm like, actually, I don't like you. I don't like you as a person. And that owning that, like, it's also like the things you're saying are hurting my ears and my heart. And that it's part of how I'm engaging this practice of, and certainly not to be like, well, because I don't like you, this is how I feel like I'm entitled to represent you. But also that the limits of that representation are precisely that. This person was not going to finish. The cup didn't finish, and then they're over, they're gone. Like this was, and so owning that kind of, that reflection, and owning that what that reflection means and does, or interpret, and owning that the kind of range of interpretive practice, because that narrative production is an interpretive production. I think the issues become, I think the issue then becomes in terms of the actual disciplinary formation. So I give an example. The number of times I see the title of an article or something that's like that, where a particular kind of sociological category shows up, and that no one examines that kind of assumption. So now you've done this work and you're dealing with material, but the way you are meant to narratively produce this is an article about 14 Black women from the township who are aged between 13 and 25. And that construction, that sociological construction, is meant to establish your authority, but it relies on a range of assumptions about Black women, about young Black women, about a township, about a particular. And so in fact, a lot of what's constructed, a lot of the interpretive potential of what else could have been in place is put aside for that sociological construction, which that sociological construction legitimates you as a researcher who not only can perform a particular kind of distance, but that the reason why that category, sociological category, it's an expedient way of not only like my distance in relation to the subject, but also it's a sociological category that legitimates a particular practice of generalization, that legitimates the kind of currency in travel of the claims. And then often, you see, then there's a certain kind of assumptive logics or jumps that they can attach. So this is going to be about sexual violence, or it's going to be about some kind of, well, this is always, in fact, this is also one of the things that we don't know how to write about ourselves without talking about it as a problem. We don't even recognize that epistemic habit at the root of most intellectual inquiry, that there is a problem, and the problem is rooted in a particular sociological subject that also looks like us. And that's my authority is going to be constructed through my capacity to remedy that problem. And then I can also simultaneously then claim to have solved the problem by simply showing how clever I am that I can diagnose it. And so the potential of that interaction, that conversation, what could have been articulated as interesting, as it's just simply, I've missed the part of my talk. I talk about, like, I started making a decision to be like, I refuse to write things that are not funny or interesting, or because I'm a really funny person. It's a shame for people not to get to read and go, ha ha ha, Danai is hilarious. Like, where's the sense of humor? Where's like inside circle? What would happen if that was written in the kind of way where there's an insider, there's many insiders and many outsiders, right? So who are the insiders and outsiders in terms of audiences? Who am I explaining to? If you're explaining to someone, why? Because you may want to explain, I want to explain to my mother and women, so maybe that's explanatory mode, but it's shaped by who I'm keeping inside. If I use inside jokes or formulations, that opacity is not simply that kind of that you don't know, but it's like, who's knowing? Am I prioritizing? Who can find this funny? Who's gonna think this is terrible? Those things, I think that those questions are at the level of our disciplines, because our disciplines give us particular forms of tools that are laden with sociological categories and assumptions, that are laden with the construction of our own authority. And so we need to then, I think, within each frame to be like, okay, so what are the tools here that I don't even have to say anything? After all of that, about all of this analysis of COVID-19, really, because I said Black women in this informal settlement, I don't even need an argument, because already my authority is established because of the subject sociologically that I can claim my expertise on and through. And so I think that's the reorientation, to say, okay, well, in historical method, this is how evidence is managed. Okay, so how does this function? what would be another way? Because I do think you do produce a narrative authority, but the absconding from the responsibility actually of your own narrative, analytical, interpretive responsibility happens when that infrastructure is what protects you, because then you could be anyone making some kind of expert nonsensical claim. And so that's what I think. So Nick, I didn't actually engage what you're saying. Now I realize, family is interesting, and I've been thinking about it because COVID-19 created the conditions for not only now having to participate in family WhatsApp groups, but being invited to them, and the full range of things, from like daily portraits of people's children. I'm like, how many photographs can you take? To like, should we take the vaccine? Should who take the vaccine? And then people bring different kinds of authoritative claims to any kind of conversation, because we also have unresolved matter with each other, unresolved things that are also in play when we communicate. So when we use our smartness in relation to each other, it's also about many other unresolved things that families carry and have between each other. And so I've been sort of witnessing my own family WhatsApp group, and sometimes I'll chime in when I'm like, this is not acceptable. But then it's like, oh, Dani again, so, so even if I come with my, my authority in this, that thing with families, that family is really amazing. It also reminding you, like, you were the person who used to, eat dog food when we were children. They also know how to put you back. There's many places we occupy within those frames of relation that also include the ways that we are, or maybe sometimes even not even recognized. Our self-importance is not recognizable always in the same kind of way within the frame of that set of relations. So there's a natural kind of way that different orientations to the world have life in that set of interactions, maybe more so than in regular professional ways. Someone can say, yeah, the horse vaccine is going to work. And then there's a field of expertise on that science that is, whether it's jokes or memes or literally like, no, I tried it. It's in as much as, it's like, yeah, here you people, there's the rollout of this vaccine is this. So I think that field of multiple registers of expertise, notwithstanding that you may really wish that nobody takes the horse vaccine, and that's maybe you want to say it because you really don't want anyone to take it. I think what it triggers maybe is more about you than about the set of interactions, at least for me. When I'm watching it and I'm like, how come we don't talk about this thing that's happening between this person as, as like, dangerous, homicidal, let's say, like normalized, like how certain kinds of violence are normalized, let's say. So no one talks about, we don't say, oh, Ningi does this kind of thing the way you would outside of your family circle. You're just like, why are we acting like this is normal behavior? Why are we normalizing? And you want to put up and diagnose it because you have this kind of critical vocabulary to put it on the table. And I've been finding more and more ways of having conversations where we don't use the same registers, but we can come to a place of an shared intention or meaning or understanding, where my authority as the one who knows more about patriarchy and racism and is not at the heart of the interaction between us, but actually to be like, that there's maybe something that we have felt that maybe is connected to our unfinished business, or even the fact that even with our families, we don't even have the capacity really to talk about things like class mobility, how our different mobilities in terms of class have reshaped our relations between when we were younger and we're older, or our capacity, those of us who work in this work, we end up being able to be anywhere and everywhere, that we don't have that language. And I think that maybe that language is built in ways that is unfamiliar to the one we're used to. I see you, Chair. I was going into preacher mode. I see you.
No, thank you very much, Danai. I mean, cool. Since we're past the time, I would like to say, first of all, thank you, Danai, for an amazing keynote. I really enjoyed myself, and it really got me thinking, especially this last bit about how families and WhatsApps and having to be that person that's always like, hey guys, but come on, is this okay? And but then also having to learn to step back. And as you said, yeah, I was once the person who ate dog food in the family, and now, and recognizing where we also come from. And I would also like to say thank you to the attendees. Thank you for the time. Thank you for giving up your time and joining us in this session. And thank you to the questions as well. It really contributed to this discussion. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you enjoyed the session. And we will see you tomorrow for the next day, day 3 of the conference. Cool, everyone, goodbye.